Hello and welcome to the Mindful Entrepreneur Podcast. We're your hosts, Tati and Jerry Jimenez.
Join us as entrepreneurs and brother and sister interview inspiring leaders in different fields to explore how they've achieved results and fulfillment. Let's get started as soul, passion, and business come together at The Mindful Entrepreneur.
Hello, everybody. We're here today with Mike Porath. We're in for such a treat. Thank you, Mike, for being here as our guest today.
Well, thanks very much for having me on.
And to let you know a little bit about Mike Porath is the founder and CEO of themighty.com, the world's fastest growing health community with more than 100 million views per month. He began his career as a journalist at ABC News, where he was the network's first overseas digital reporter, and where his reporting from Kosovo was awarded the top prize in online journalism. He has held a variety of writing, editing, producing, and executive roles at ABC News, NBC News, the New York Times, and AOL. Mike is also on the board of directors and fundraising chair for Dup15q Alliance, a nonprofit organization that supports people with Dup15q syndrome, including his daughter. What an impressive resume.
Well, thanks. Yeah, it hasn't been a straight line. I feel like I've kind of jumped around and done some different things, but it's been fun, and I've learned a lot along the way.
So before we dive in, we've got to let our audience know that we recently met Mike at an event in a small group setting. And Mike, we would love to share this with you as well. We walked away so inspired by not only your knowledge, but also by the genuine caring you shared with the community there, the startup community. So yes, let's get started.
Okay, great.
Could you share with us a little bit more about who Mike is and the backstory behind how you came into entrepreneurship? You were talking about how it was a bit of a segue.
So I was born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio, and went to college at William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. And I think, back in those days, I knew that I always loved storytelling. I knew, I thought I was going to grow up to be a writer at some point. I wasn't really sure. And I eventually, my mom helped me figure out, she made me realize how many student loans I had coming out of college, and that I was going to have to, get a job and figure all this out. And that actually, pushed me to, while I was in college, I applied for about 40 internships. And I got one, so I got turned down 39 times. Either got no response or rejections. But that taught me a lesson, which is that you only need one. And for me, that was an internship at ABC News in New York. And so I that was working in a documentary unit there, and so that was that internship turned into a job after my senior year in college. So I moved up to New York, literally with a duffel bag, moved in with a couple friends, and waited tables until that job opened up at ABC. But that was kind of my in terms of like getting into the media side. And I loved every bit of it. I worked in documentaries for a while, back in the late 90s, which is, dating myself, but that's when abcnews.com, they started to put a lot of investment into it. And I moved over to the digital side back then. And from then on out, it was a mixture of, it was mostly digital media that I worked in, a little bit of print and a little bit of television as well, but mostly digital media. And I kind of rode that wave. The consumption around digital media has really gone up. And so a lot of media companies have invested a lot of money into it. And so that gave me opportunities for some amazing roles at ABC News, NBC News, New York Times, and eventually at AOL. I ran all basically the news sites there. And again, I learned a lot through all that, mostly on the editorial side and storytelling. But I kind of reached a point at AOL where I focused as much on the business side as well as the editorial side, and started managing different groups. And I loved every bit of that. And so that kind of encouraged me to, when there was an opportunity to join a startup that was out here in LA, kind of move the family out here and kind of join and see if I could help, build a media company. And there was some successes and failures with that company. And, over the course of about 3 years, I joined when it was 60 people, left when it was 250. And that experience, along with all the storytelling that I learned at big news companies, I felt like prepared me to do something on my own. And while all of that was going on the personal side, because the Mighty is kind of a merge between my professional experience and my personal experience. On the personal side, my wife and I have 3 kids, and our oldest has a rare chromosome disorder called Dup15q syndrome. And what my wife and I found was that in terms of, parenting a child with special needs, Annabelle has autism and a number of other challenges, that the way that we got the most help was by connecting with other people. And so the long way of saying the idea of the Mighty came about from me having worked and built, digital communities and news sites and those things, along with the feeling that I had, which was that there were a lot of people that felt isolated and alone dealing with any variety of health conditions, and that we could provide a digital platform to allow those folks to connect. Again, going back to my experience on the storytelling side, I felt like the right way to build communities was through these personal experiences. And online, those personal experiences take the form of stories, or they often can. And so that's where we started. We didn't start with some like whiz-bang product or app that allowed you to do all sorts of things. We started with personal experiences as stories, and trying to get those in front of people that will be impacted by them, or the same way I was when our daughter was diagnosed. And so that's where we started, and it's grown considerably. Those first few months, it was just me and one other person, our editor, and we were happy to get a couple thousand visits a day. And now our stories and videos and all that get seen about 3 to 4 million times a day in the course of 3 years. So it's kind of been a wild ride from
Wow.
3 years ago to where we're at now.
It's so beautiful to see that your daughter was such an inspiration for what is such a big project nowadays. That's awesome.
And with all the growth that the Mighty has achieved, would you say that the goal has already been accomplished, or is there more that you guys are after? Because that's impressive.
If you asked our team, they would be very clear that our goals are nowhere near accomplished. I thinking big picture, there are, obviously billions of people out there across the world that are dealing with any kinds of different health issues. Some on their own, some they're a caregiver, some are medical professionals, right, that are trying to help people. And I feel like we have an opportunity, like the internet was designed to connect people, and yet so many people feel isolated with whatever kind of, issues they're dealing with. And so, big picture, where we want the Mighty to eventually be is the day someone would get diagnosed, with something, or maybe, even sooner than that, it would be a place that they could connect with others that are dealing with the same things, with those experiences that others have had be shared with the person who's kind of, coming into this. And those could be, both people had a certain kind of health condition or disability. It could be that there's a medical professional out there that feels like they've got a lot of information that they want to get to people. So how do we organize, these billions of experiences and, around health in a way that's going to be extremely valuable to the person, who's trying to help themselves or a loved one. That's a big challenge. And, that's ultimately, what we're trying to go after.
Speaking of challenges, that leads us perfectly into our next question. Obviously, there are physical challenges to you achieving what you have. What challenges did you face in terms of both mindset and then the physical aspect of building such a big community?
Early on, one of the challenges in terms of, I feel like where a lot of folks get stuck is on actually moving from idea to starting something. And, the idea behind what the Mighty is now, it's very similar to what it started out being, but it's evolved quite a bit. And that idea had been floating around in my head for a couple years. So it's not as if I just woke up one day, I'm like, okay, this is what we're going to do. So for me, and I don't know what the right or wrong, if there is a right or wrong process to this, but what happened for me is I started thinking more and more about it, and I felt like I had the the professional skills to pull this off. And I talked with so many different people that I'd worked with across my career, right? And whether it's in media and technology, and I joke around that I spent a lot of money on dinners and drinks, just taking people out and talking to them. And what happened was a lot of them actually ended those conversations by saying, "Let me help you." Right? It wasn't just that they wanted to help with ideas, but it's something that I learned all sorts of things from people that they were dealing with things that I didn't know about. And so all of a sudden I had a lot of people who wanted to help get this thing started. And then ultimately, I say my wife really, kind of gave me a kick in the ass. She was sick of me talking about doing all this and just said, let's, if we're going to do it, let's do this. And that, that really helped me in terms of the starting. So I think the first challenge was moving from idea to starting. And then in terms of starting, the first thing was our personal finances, right? I felt like I needed to leave my job, but I had lined up a bunch of consulting gigs. My wife's a stay-at-home mom, so we're not independently wealthy or anything like that. So how would we actually, I wanted to be able to get by the first year just without running out of personal money or selling our house or those kinds of things. And so lining up those consulting gigs and kind of devoting as much time as possible to it, waking up super early in the morning, going to bed late at night, working on different aspects of it. That was a challenge of just getting it up and running. We didn't go out and seek funding before we started. We just started. I hired an editor who was the top writer at Huffington Post, and just she bought into what the idea was, and I needed that initial partner to really help get things going. And so then the next big challenge I think was on the funding side, and figuring out, do we become a nonprofit? Do we become a kind of family-run business, or do we go for something much bigger? And that's ultimately what we decided to do, which was go out and raise money from investors and eventually venture capitalists to try to build this into something that's much, much larger, that wouldn't require us to necessarily be out, asking for donations along the way. Because the vision was a big one, we felt like we were going to need a lot of capital along the way, and we knew that would mean we have to prove our progress along the way and those things. But that's ultimately what we decided to do. And then how do you go out and raise money from folks on an idea and just getting started? So that was kind of the second set of challenges. And then the third one was, once we were able to accomplish that, it was building the team and getting that team to execute. As a startup, most of the people that joined our company did so taking pay cuts, right? And believing in the bigger mission, and getting the right people on board and getting them aligned to achieve the goals that we have is kind of, I feel like, the third set of challenges. So again, it was kind of like how to get started, then how to figure out the capital required and to build it into something bigger, and then using that capital as efficiently as possible to build the team and the execution around it. There's three unique challenges, but I feel like to get to where we're at now, we had to solve each one of them.
How did you get the capital to move forward?
So, there's different ways to go about doing it. The typical way is to find, some people ask family and friends. I wanted to avoid that, and fortunately was able to, but that's where a lot of people start. And then they move to finding angel investors, and there's angel investors, around the country. You don't need to be in Silicon Valley or, somewhere like that in order to raise money, for them. So for me, it was, I had some conversations with folks that kind of lived in that world, in the investment world, and I didn't go and actually ask for money initially. I asked for help in figuring out what was the right path, and I think that approach worked well, and it's one that I would suggest to others. It's, in a way, it's easier for people to invest when you ask for help, but when you ask for money, it frankly can make it harder. But if they really like the idea and what you're doing, they sometimes will just say this, hey, how can I be an investor, or something like that. And so I was fortunate to be introduced to a person named Joanne Wilson, who's a well-known angel investor in New York City, and set up a phone call, with her. and, which was weeks of planning even to get the phone call with her. And then just had a discussion about what we were doing, why I thought it would work, the impact that we wanted to have, all of those things, how I was leveraging my, kind of professional experience in doing this. At that time, I think in the first 4 months as a 2-person operation, and I was part-time on it, we had already gotten to close to 500,000 visits, a month on what we were doing. So I think she bought into the team, even our small 2-person team, the traction that we had, and then the idea. And I didn't ask for any money. I didn't have a pitch deck or anything like that. It was just a conversation. And she emailed me the next day and said, I can't get this out of my head. Like, I think you should start raising money, and I'd like to write the first check. And that's basically how it started. And then you leverage the investors that you start bringing on to introduce you to other investors. And fortunately for me, Joanne is a what I call a super connector. She literally knows everybody. And so she really helped get the ball rolling in terms of bringing, other folks on. She told me, okay, now it's time to put your deck together, right? And help give me some advice on that. And of course, I'm reading books on all these things and reading investor blogs. And then it was just a matter of going out and talking to people and showing them what we were doing. And again, for us, I think the team and the traction that we had, along with the big idea, is what got us over the hump. But for different kinds of startups, it can be different things. It could be that someone was a very successful entrepreneur, and so when they're raising money the next time, folks are like, wow, this person's done it before. Like, that wasn't me. I didn't have that going through. Some people do. If you're trying a brand new thing out that you have no experience in whatsoever, I do think it's harder, but maybe being able to show that you have tremendous traction already on something, or that, for some folks, like, they have revenue initially. We're 3 years in and we don't have much revenue, but we've got a lot of growth. For some folks, they may not have the growth, but maybe they have revenue, or maybe so you basically help, you figure out your story based on the selling points that you do have, and try to, answer and be prepared to answer questions on the things that you don't have. But I don't think there's one single way to do it. I think it's just a matter of figuring out, what are the strongest selling points. But then you just got to get in front of people and, be prepared to get a lot of rejections. You just need a few yeses.
It's interesting. I heard you say today something that you also mentioned when we met one-on-one. And I think it's a really interesting idea that entrepreneurs should really take in. And that's, don't do it for the money. And you said this, don't start doing it for the money. Do it because it's a passion and it drives you. And I think when you approached your first investor, not asking for money, but asking for help, I think that you were right. I mean, that's a very interesting pitch. You weren't really pitching, you were asking for help, but it's a different approach.
Yeah. I mean, even when she asked about, how we, in terms of, were we setting up a business versus a nonprofit or whatever. And I said, I think the reason that I want to go this route eventually was because it could actually accomplish our mission in a bigger way, right? We can actually do more good for people by being a VC-backed business than I thought that we could do as a nonprofit. And as you mentioned in the intro, I have experience on the nonprofit side as well. And I think there's some things that nonprofits do extremely well, and there's some things that, companies do extremely well. And I felt like we could actually, in some ways, serve nonprofits much better by being more of the media or tech company that can ultimately, I think, in the long run, drive a lot of fundraising for nonprofits. But again, it's the ultimate goal was to, frankly, help people like my wife and me, that when we were in our situation, and still are, but in those early days when we really felt isolated and scared and alone, and getting this diagnosis of a rare disorder that, we were told at the time we only knew of 300 families around the world, with this particular condition. And, look, doctors are trying to be as helpful as they can, but most had never seen or heard of this. So getting in touch with those families and learning about what's worked for them, what's helped their kids, and those kind of things was really important. And I just, that was, the mission was really about helping people with whatever they're dealing with. And we ultimately figured that the best way to, get to those people is to grow this into something very large. And the best way to grow it into something very large was to become more of a venture-backed organization.
There seems to be a thread in your career path for building communities and creating teams. How could someone get really good at being that type of leader?
That's a great question. I think it helps to get management experience along the way. When I meet and talk with a lot of other entrepreneurs, and I'm fascinated by the folks who are these young startup founders who are 24 years old and are building a fast growing company, because I rely so much on the management side on lots of successes and failures over the last 20 years. And if I didn't have those, I don't frankly know how those folks get as much experience as they need, quickly. But for me, I really do rely on what I've seen in the past and what's happened to me in the past. I've hired, the last two companies I worked at before starting the Mighty. I had over 100 people on each of those teams, and so I did a lot of hiring. I unfortunately had to do some firing and layoffs and all of that. And what I realized along the way is no one should ever be shocked when they're if they're not living up to their expectations, and one day they figure out they're being let go or they've been fired or something like that. And so even in terms of bringing people into the company, we talk about what the expectations are. We talk about how if I think that there's an issue or their manager thinks there's any kind of issue, we talk about it right away. If they see that there's any issues, they bring it to our attention right away. Because our goal as managers, as leaders within a company, is to set people up to be successful. And that's on us. And but it's on the individual then to live up to those expectations. And if there's something that's not working, let's be honest and talk about it. So that's kind of what we brought into our culture. But you could read that in a book maybe, but I think actually having to live through it in different jobs and all that, at least for me, has been incredibly helpful. So for me, again, I rely more on the experience, of it. But others, I think, they bring on advisors and other things like that and talk through it. I do think as a startup founder, one of the things I underestimated was that how much anxiety and pressure and all that is on that lone individual. And so, getting some help, getting a coach, it doesn't have to be a formal role, but getting someone you can lean on and have discussions with, I think is incredibly important.
Mike, I love how much emphasis you have on not only asking for help, which is showing a vulnerable side as well in terms of a business owner, but also providing help for others. In this case, in terms of rare conditions. My question, that keeps going on in the back of my head is your background, growing up as a family. Did you already have that awareness, that sensibility, or how does that happen?
That's a good question. Yeah, I'm trying to think. Like, I didn't experience a lot of problems as a kid. I had like a really normal, like typical upbringing in a great family, and I didn't. We were kind of middle class in Cleveland, Ohio, and my dad was a Hallmark card salesman for over 30 years, and coached me and my three siblings in all of our sports and all that kind of stuff. I think we grew up with good values, and so even though I didn't have, experiences of a lot of, what I would say are like really, challenging life experiences maybe growing up, I think I grew up with good values. And I think that, and not just in what we're doing here, but in my past professional life working with folks, I think that those have maybe come across, but given how many people wanted to help, help me with getting this started. So I think, those things have served me well. But it's, outside of, having a daughter with a rare chromosome disorder, like up until then, I can't say that I had a lot of challenges, growing up or in college or, beyond that. That was really kind of the toughest moment of figuring out, this wasn't part of the plan, right? And then ultimately, like, okay, how do we help our daughter? And again, this is what my wife and I decided to do, and this is again based on our own personal experiences. I'm not saying others have to come to the same conclusion, but what we looked at with her situation, Annabelle's situation, was that we decided that the two most important things for us was that she was as happy as could possibly be, and that she could be as independent as she could possibly be. And so, because you get through, there's therapists and there's doctors and there's teachers, all these people that you're working with, and and ultimately we figured out that our plan was going to be based on those two things. So when we meet with a new therapist, when we meet with next year's teacher or whatever, we let them know these are the things that we're striving for. We kind of align our what we call our team, right, which are made up of doctors and therapists and teachers and all sorts of others, and we make sure that they know what we're trying to help our daughter with. And I think it's really helped us in terms of figuring out what we want to do for her personally. And I do think that experience certainly was part of the Mighty, because it was a very personal thing. This wasn't built on a business model the way a lot of startups are. It was built on how do we help people with a really tough thing going on in their lives. And I think that's probably caused a lot of our growth, because it really, everyone who comes into the company knows that. And if we operate with that kind of thinking about how do we help our contributors, our readers, we work with hundreds of nonprofits, all of that, and we truly do want to help them. I think that's been conveyed, and that's ultimately what's helped us grow more than anything else.
It's a great mission, Mike. Yeah, thank you. It's a really great mission to strive to making such a big impact. So you mentioned something about having a coach or a mentor, and it made me wonder, growing up, who inspired you? And today, do you have any mentors, anybody that?
Yeah, I'd say growing up, it's kind of a cliche answer, but my dad is, he coached all of our teams, and I grew up probably hyper competitive. I'm a extremely competitive person, probably to a fault. But I think I got a lot of that from my dad, is again, coaching all of our, teams growing up. And so that's what I would say. That's where I think I got a lot of the coaching and all that growing up. From a professional point of view, I think a lot of the people, both peers and people that I've worked for, have helped me in different ways. There's one who stands out, his name's Louis Dvorkin. He was my boss at AOL. And I think he pushed me more than anybody else professionally. I worked, under him for a few years. He actually went off and did his own startup, eventually sold it to Forbes. He now, his title is Chief Product Officer at Forbes, but the truth is he runs all of editorial, magazine, digital, all the product. He's, intimately involved in their sales operation, pretty much everything that they do, the brand that they're building, all that. And so he was actually one of the very first people I went and talked to about building the Mighty, because he left AOL and did his own startup, and so he'd experienced some of that, and he also knew me really well. And so he was a skeptic, honestly, early on about why, could this work? And you need those people around you. You don't need all the people that are just saying yes, yes, yes. You need people saying, no, I don't think that's going to work. No, have you really thought about it this way? And so ultimately, I think I credit him with really helping me think through a lot of the challenges of building something like we have. And ultimately, when it came down to building a board of directors, I asked him to join the board of directors because I wanted his advice formally, not just, informally as well. And he's been, super supportive in that role. So he's certainly, I wouldn't call him the only mentor I have, but he's probably the one that has helped me the most with building the Mighty.
That's great that you have. I keep hearing the theme about teams teaming up, partnering. And I'm wondering if we can take advantage of the platform that is this podcast to team up and maybe share more about awareness of what Dup15q is, so that
Sure.
you guys
Yeah,
know.
so Dup15q syndrome is it's a duplication on the 15th chromosome in the Q arm. And it's basically people with Dup15q have an extra set of genes that are attached. It's not unlike Down syndrome in the sense of, the condition's nothing like Down syndrome, but with Down syndrome, there's an extra set of chromosomes as well. And so, so that's the condition itself. And it's, again, we kind of came into it with a, there's only 300 people in this nonprofit organization around the world. Now it's about, fast forward 7-8 years, there's about 1,300 families. But the truth is, there's actually, our scientific advisory board thinks there's thousands of people living with this condition in the U.S. And, we have no members from India or China, which is shocking in the sense of you look at the population sizes. Clearly, there are people in a lot of places around the world who just haven't been diagnosed with it. The condition itself, for most people, like most people with Dup15q syndrome have autism. Most have epilepsy. I'd say roughly about half are nonverbal. In all cases, there's some degree of cognitive impairment. So those are main. A lot of the main things that the families that are helping those living with Dup15q syndrome are trying to work through and figure out. But the range of independence and those kind of things varies greatly with people with this condition. So I'm incredibly impressed by the organization Dup15q Alliance. It really was one of the inspirations behind starting this as well, and that we wanted to help organizations like Dup15q Alliance get in front of far more people, hopefully raise more money, all of those kinds of things. But the organization, again, is a relatively small nonprofit, has opened up clinics around the country. We talk about like engagement and community. I learned a lot of it from Dup15q Alliance. We do an international conference every 2 years. And the last one, we had over 400 people, the families coming, people flying in from South Africa and Australia and all over. It's as spread out as we are globally, it is actually a very close-knit community of people trying to help each other out, and we've been able to bring on great researchers and scientists and have a number of things in the works that hopefully will improve the quality of life of people living with this condition. So I believe very strongly in organizations like this, and they're true for around any kind of rare disease. There's likely, or at least there's organizations like this, and it's amazing what a small group of people, can accomplish. And, I'm proud to be a member of that, organization. As I kind of by default became fundraising chair because my wife and I had a pretty successful fundraiser, for the Alliance. And then it was a matter of, how do we scale this? How do we turn it into something bigger? How do we get more people involved? And that's where I felt like I could help the organization more than anything. I wish I was this, great doctor who could, or researcher or scientist that could do all these different things. And the truth is that's just not me. And I'm not going to be as helpful that way. The way that I think I can help the organization most is through the fundraising side.
Thank you for sharing that, and congratulations on your new job title, the fundraising. I'm gonna turn it back. I want to come back to this topic maybe at the end, but I want to turn it back because I think our audience will not forgive us if we didn't ask you this question. How can somebody go from 0 to 500,000 users in the first 4 months and up to, you said 3-4 million now of views? How can somebody do that? How, could you share a little bit of your experience there?
So here's where I think most people go wrong, and then I'll get into how we did it. I think a lot of people feel like if they create, this is from a digital media perspective at least, that if they create great content, it'll get out there. And a lot of people will watch it or listen to it or anything like that. And I wish that were true. The world would be a great place if that were true. Unfortunately, it's not. You need to be found. And so our perspective on it, I came into this with the belief that we needed to put at least as much time into how do we get these great stories, not just how do we get the great stories, but at least as much time spending on figuring out how we get them in front of people who will identify with in a meaningful way. So there's different ways to go about it. There are companies, digital media companies or organizations that focus on, search optimization, right? So how does Google crawl your site and rank you highly for these kinds of things? In health, that's really, really challenging. There are, companies worth billions of dollars who would dominate that. And I didn't feel like we necessarily wanted to compete with them or would win at that. And I frankly didn't know as much about that side of things. What I had learned through some of the companies that I'd been a part of was how to really improve the social engagement, right? The getting people to share a story with others. And in health, that happens at a much higher rate. It can if it's the right story, because people, this is an important thing in their lives going on. So sharing a health story, if it's what we realized was personal experiences get shared way more than an informational, here are symptoms around X, Y, or Z. And so our approach was, let's put way more time in terms of figuring out how to get stories in front of people that will identify with them. And number two, that means we have to, if we create stories that are very, very shareable, and we get them in front of people who identify with them, that's way more likely that they will then spread those around to other people that are like them. And the challenge that I kind of put to our, it was just one other editor at the time, but eventually our team was, we're not going to spend any money on marketing. So how are we going to do this without it? That was a crutch I didn't want to use. And so even today, we don't, other than writing thank you notes to our contributors, like that's, the stamps are our marketing costs, right? It's not, we don't buy traffic. We don't, kind of use all the techniques that thing is, I know a lot of those techniques really well, but I felt like if we were going to build something big and meaningful, let's actually challenge ourselves in how we're going to go about doing it. So what we did is we looked at where are people, now that we're getting these stories coming in around personal experience around any kind of health condition, how do we get them in front of other people that are in those people's shoes? And so we went around the web really trying to figure that problem out. And we found that it was, there's a number of ways, getting nonprofits to share our stories with their community. Generally, nonprofits have done a good job building community, but are not particularly good at content. So, asking them, hey, we've got these great stories. Would you be interested in sharing these with your community? And through that, are there ways that we can help you by driving more awareness around your organization? So those kind of partnerships really helped us. And then on the other side, we looked at other places, whether it could be a subreddit around a particular condition. How do we get our stories on that subreddit? Message boards around different sites. Those things helped us. And then, I'm not going to lie, I absolutely leveraged my media relationships. Be able to get, a Huffington Post or some other organization to share a link here or there, which is not where most of the traffic was coming from, but those kinds of things certainly helped us kind of kickstart, some of these things. And then a lot of it is just trial and error. I mean, we tried a ton of things out that didn't work. So, I remember at one point having I initially was working out of a little office that's not really an office. It's the back room of our garage. But I had a little whiteboard up there, and I had 100 lines in there where each time we would attempt something, I would put a check. And it didn't matter if it was successful or not, but it was a matter of if we try 100 things, we're going to find some things that work. And so really, just figuring out those things. It turns out that, a couple of those things that we tried were, that really worked well. And a whole lot of things we tried didn't work at all. But we know going in which ones would work. It was a lot of just, trial by error.
It's a great attitude because, a lot of times everybody wants to get it just right before you release or you go into market. And
yeah. I mean, our website cost $1,200 to get up and running. It was not I asked, a friend of mine to help with a simple WordPress site, just get it up and then we'll figure it out. We'll make a better design as we go and all of those things. But unless we started, I felt like at some point you just have to start.
Yeah.
And you don't have to be perfect, and that we work with that kind of philosophy. Even what's Facebook's mantra, something like move fast and break things, right? And I agree with that approach in general. So you just have to get going and figure out things along the way.
Since we're on that topic, 3 recommendations would you make to somebody that's starting out?
I'd say start. Launch something, because it's so easy to say, oh, I got to read one more book about this, or I need to have so many conversations or whatever. At some point you do have to start. That said, you want to be prepared. And for me, at least, it was talking to a lot of people that knew things that I didn't know. And so, have as many of those conversations as you can, but don't let that, stop you from actually starting something. I think folks going in should know that if you want to grow something that's quite sizable, it's not going to be you alone, right? So whether or not you find co-founders, whether or not you're building a team, you're finding investors, it's not all about you. And so you're going to have to, people think of sales as, generating revenue. Well, sales and startup, you're selling this idea to investors, you're selling this idea to employees, or volunteers, or whatever kind of organization you're starting. And so you don't underestimate how important that aspect is. If you can, I'm amazed at some of the employees that we've brought into this organization, and the experience level that they have in areas where my strength is not in technology. So to find someone who comes in a very early stage, a 15, 20 person company, and he's built and managed 50, 60 person engineering teams. I'm amazed that, and working for an organization that was doing $100 million in revenue, leading all of technology for that. And he left that 60 person team behind. He's working out of his house now, because he doesn't live in LA with the rest of us, but he wants to build this. Right. And so it's not a matter of he's certainly not making more money. There's a lot, but he believes in the mission and the team and what we're doing. And I do think people who are starting things out need to really figure out how they're going to sell this idea. Because at the beginning, it's an idea, right? And you got to sell it to a whole lot of different people in order to get things going. And just to know that is a very big part of whether or not something works or not is, can you get those other people, again, investors, employees, volunteers, partners, whatever it is on board, is going to be based on, can you sell it?
Yeah.
Right.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. So to wrap it up, Mike, what is next for you, and how could our community support your vision?
So next for me is just a matter of taking what we've done here and kind of growing to the next level. So, there's nothing else I want to do right now than build the mighty, which is, I feel very fortunate and blessed to be in that situation where, a number of people have given me this opportunity now to continue to grow it. So that's really what's next for me, for the organization. Again, we started more on the storytelling side. Our first 19,000 and some stories that we've written now have been read over 300 million times. And so it's a matter of where are those next 100,000 stories coming from, right? And how do we get them in front of more people? But beyond that, it's really what we're going to focus much more on is the technology side. It started with these personal experiences, but we want to now build all the tools in to allow people to connect in all sorts of ways that they can't do on the site today. We're listening to our audience, our community, and we need to deliver on what they're asking us for. And a lot of that is tools to connect. So we're going to put a big emphasis on that and more video, because video has the power right now through social media to reach so many more people. It's a great device in terms of telling the kinds of stories based on personal experience, with health conditions that I think will work for us. So those are areas that we're kind of focused on, and also building it into a sustainable, organization, financially. So that's kind of what's next for the mighty in those ways. And for me, it's just, continuing to try to, to build this into something that can have a lot of meaning for a lot of people.
I have one last question, and I know we're past the time, but if you had to choose one or two, three things to what you owe your success, like if you could just choose 1, 2, 3, because not only on the professional, but the impact.
I'd say I've gotten way better at asking for help.
Okay, got it.
I am a bit of a cockroach in that I don't die. I fail all the time at all kinds of things. I just keep going. And so you call that a survivor. I call it a cockroach. I'd say those two. And I think that I'm doing things that I'm passionate about. I would not be as good at doing things that I wasn't as interested in just personally and curious about and all that. So I think I've been fortunate in working on projects that are deeply meaningful to me, and that makes it a whole lot easier. So those are at least a couple off the top of my head.
So we want to thank you for your time. Definitely a great conversation, just like the first time. And we hope to see you soon if we get a chance, and to hear more success stories in the years to come, Mike. Thank you for your time.
Hey, and before you leave, both the Genius Spot and Vita Factor want to thank you, our awesome audience, for being part of our podcast. And if you found this episode of value, please share it with your friends and loved ones so they too can join the Mindful Entrepreneur.